When Michael Turner first installed security cameras around his newly purchased house in a quiet suburb outside of Denver, he thought it was just a simple precaution, the kind of thing most homeowners did these days for peace of mind, especially since the neighborhood had experienced a few break-ins over the past year. But within a week, he would begin to realize that those cameras were capturing something far worse than a burglar. The house itself had seemed perfect when Michael bought it. A modest two-story property with large windows, a quiet backyard, and just enough distance from neighboring homes to feel private. The previous owner had sold it unusually quickly, something the realtor had explained away as a job relocation, and Michael hadn't questioned it because the price was far lower than similar homes in the area. On the first night he moved in, the silence of the house felt comforting rather than unsettling. After months of apartment noise and city traffic, the quiet suburban street felt like a dream. The cameras were installed mostly around the exterior, one at the front door, one overlooking the driveway, one in the backyard, and another in the hallway upstairs. The system automatically recorded whenever motion was detected, saving short clips that Michael could review through an app on his phone. For the first few days, the cameras only captured normal things: a stray cat walking through the yard, the mailman approaching the front door, branches swaying in the wind. But on the fourth night, around 2:17 a.m., Michael's phone buzzed with a motion alert from the upstairs hallway camera. Half asleep, he opened the clip expecting to see nothing important, but what he saw instead made his chest tighten instantly. The video showed a tall figure standing at the far end of the hallway, partially hidden in the darkness near the staircase. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there facing the camera. Michael sat upright in bed, staring at the screen. The hallway outside his bedroom door was completely silent. Slowly, cautiously, he opened the bedroom door and looked out into the hall. Nothing was there. The hallway lights were off, and the shadows stretched along the walls exactly the way they always did at night. Confused, Michael replayed the video again. The figure in the recording looked like a man, but something about it seemed wrong. Its posture was unnatural, shoulders slightly hunched forward, arms hanging loosely at its sides like they were too heavy to hold up. The most disturbing part was its face. Even in the dim camera footage, Michael could see that the figure's face looked pale and expressionless, with eyes that seemed to reflect the camera's infrared light in a dull white glow. Michael checked the timestamps. The video had been recorded less than a minute earlier. He walked through the entire house, checking every room, every closet, every locked door. Nothing. The next morning, he convinced himself it must have been some kind of glitch. Maybe the camera had recorded his own movement earlier and triggered the alert late. But 2 nights later, the alert came again. This time, the recording showed the figure standing closer to the camera. Michael's stomach dropped when he realized the figure was now only a few feet from his bedroom door. The worst part was that the figure was facing directly toward the camera, as if it knew exactly where it was. Michael rushed into the hallway immediately after receiving the alert, but once again the house was empty. Over the next week, the alerts continued almost every night, always around the same time, always showing the figure somewhere in the hallway. Each new video showed it slightly closer to Michael's bedroom door than the previous one. Michael stopped sleeping normally. Instead, he stayed awake most nights watching the camera feed live on his phone, waiting to see the figure appear. For several nights, nothing happened. The hallway remained empty. Then one night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the figure appeared again, but this time the camera didn't record motion clip. Michael saw it in the live feed. The figure was standing directly outside his bedroom door. Slowly, almost lazily, it lifted its head toward the camera. And then Michael realized something that made his blood run cold. The figure's face wasn't expressionless. It was smiling. The smile stretched far wider than any human smile should have, pulling the corners of its mouth upward in a way that looked painfully unnatural. Michael dropped his phone and backed away from the door. At that exact moment, he heard a soft tapping sound from the other side of the bedroom door. 3 slow knocks. Michael didn't move. The knocks came again, louder this time. His phone buzzed on the floor with another camera notification. When he picked it up and looked at the screen, the hallway camera feed was still active, but the hallway was empty. The thing that had been standing there was gone. A third knock came from the door, followed by the faint sound of breathing from the other side. Michael grabbed his keys and ran out of the bedroom window onto the roof of the garage, climbing down and driving away without looking back. He never returned to that house. Months later, when the property was eventually resold to another family, Michael still checked the camera app occasionally out of morbid curiosity. The new owners had apparently kept the security system installed. One night, while scrolling through the saved clips, Michael noticed a familiar timestamp, 2:17 a.m. The hallway camera had triggered again. When he opened the video, his heart nearly stopped. The tall, pale figure was standing in the hallway once more. But this time, it wasn't facing the camera. It was standing directly in front of the new owner's bedroom door. And slowly, deliberately, it began knocking. When Rachel Donovan and her husband Eric bought the old two-story house outside a quiet town in Vermont, they believed they had found the perfect place to start over. The property sat at the end of a long gravel road surrounded by tall pine trees, far from traffic and city noise. To Rachel, the isolation felt peaceful, almost magical. The house itself looked charming despite its age: white wooden siding, a wide porch, and a steep roof with a small attic window near the peak. The realtor had told them the house was nearly 70 years old but well-maintained, though she also mentioned that the previous owners had moved out very suddenly. At the time, Rachel and Eric didn't think much about it. They were simply excited to have a large house at a price far below what similar homes cost. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. They unpacked boxes, painted walls, and slowly settled into a comfortable routine. But Rachel noticed something strange about the house almost immediately. Every night, usually sometime after midnight, she heard faint sounds coming from above the ceiling, quiet scratching noises like something dragging slowly across the attic floor. At first she assumed it was an animal. Old houses often had squirrels or raccoons living in the attic. Eric promised he would check it eventually, but the days kept passing and the sounds continued. One night the scratching was louder than usual. Rachel was lying awake in bed, listening to it, when she heard something else mixed into the noise. It sounded like whispering. The voice was faint and distorted, like someone speaking through a wall. She sat up in bed and listened more carefully. The scratching stopped, and the whisper came again. It sounded like a single word repeated over and over, but she couldn't understand what it was saying. Rachel nudged Eric awake and asked if he heard it too. Eric listened for a moment and shrugged it off as the wind moving through the roof vents. Rachel tried to believe him, but the uneasy feeling stayed with her. The next afternoon, Eric finally decided to check the attic. The only access was through a small wooden hatch in the hallway ceiling. He grabbed a ladder and pushed the hatch open while Rachel stood nearby holding a flashlight. A rush of cold, dusty air spilled down from the opening. Eric climbed halfway up the ladder and shined a flashlight into the attic. "Looks empty," he said. "Just insulation and old beams." He climbed down and closed the hatch. But that night, the whispering returned, louder this time. Rachel woke up around 3 a.m. and immediately heard it. The voice was clearer now. It sounded like someone slowly repeating the same phrase again and again. "Rachel, Rachel, Rachel." Her blood ran cold. Eric was asleep beside her. The voice was definitely coming from above the ceiling. Rachel shook Eric awake and told him what she heard. This time Eric looked concerned. They both sat in silence, listening to the ceiling. For a few minutes nothing happened. Then the whisper came again, clearly forming her name. Eric immediately got out of bed and grabbed the ladder again. Rachel followed him into the hallway with a growing sense of dread. Eric pushed the attic hatch open and climbed up with a flashlight. The beam of light moved slowly across the dark space. Dust floated through the air like tiny insects. "There's nothing up here," Eric called down. Then he stopped speaking. The flashlight beam suddenly froze in one spot. "What is it?" Rachel asked nervously. Eric didn't answer right away. After a long moment, he said quietly, "There are footprints up here." Rachel felt her stomach drop. Eric climbed back down the ladder slowly. His face looked pale. "Someone's been walking around up there," he said. "But the insulation is thick. You'd only see footprints if they were made recently." Rachel stared up at the dark opening in the ceiling. "Maybe the previous owners?" she suggested weakly. Eric shook his head. No, these are fresh. That night, neither of them slept. The whispering continued almost constantly until morning. Over the next several days, things became worse. Objects began moving around the house when Rachel and Eric weren't looking. Doors that had been closed would suddenly be open again. Lights turned on in empty rooms. And every night, the whispering in the attic grew louder. Sometimes it sounded like a single voice calling Rachel's name. Other times it sounded like several voices speaking at once. Eric eventually decided to install a small camera in the attic to prove there was nothing up there. The camera connected to his phone so he could check the footage anytime. For the first few days, the camera recorded nothing unusual. Then one night, Eric's phone buzzed with a motion alert. The attic camera had detected movement. He opened the app, expecting to see an animal wandering around. Instead, the footage showed a dark shape slowly crawling across the insulation. At first, Eric thought it was a person lying flat on the floor, but as the shape moved closer to the camera, he realized something was wrong. The limbs were too long. The body moved in a jerking, unnatural motion, dragging itself forward with slow, scraping movements. Rachel watched over his shoulder as the figure crawled directly toward the camera. When its face finally came into view, Rachel screamed. The face was pale and stretched thin, with sunken black eyes and a mouth hanging open in a silent grin. The thing stopped inches from the camera lens. Slowly, it leaned closer until its face filled the screen. Then it whispered in a raspy voice that sounded exactly like Rachel's own voice. "I'm still up here." The camera feed suddenly cut to black. Eric rushed to the hallway and pulled down the attic ladder. But when he climbed up with the flashlight, the attic was completely empty again. The footprints were gone. The insulation looked untouched. That night, Rachel and Eric packed their belongings and left the house before sunrise. They sold it a few months later without ever explaining the real reason. But Rachel still sometimes wakes up at night to a faint whisper in the darkness of her bedroom. And every time she hears it, the voice is still calling her name. When Jason Miller bought the small brick house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood in Ohio, he believed he had finally found the peaceful life he had been searching for. The house was older but charming, surrounded by tall maple trees and sitting on a quiet street where almost nothing seemed to happen. Jason had spent most of his 20s moving from apartment to apartment, dealing with loud neighbors and constant noise, so owning a quiet house felt like a dream come true. The only unusual thing about the property was the basement. The realtor had mentioned it briefly during the showing, saying it was unfinished but spacious, perfect for storage or maybe a future renovation. Jason didn't think much about it at the time. When he first walked down the narrow wooden steps into the basement, he noticed the air felt colder than the rest of the house. The walls were bare concrete, and a single dim bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak yellow light across the room. Most of the basement was empty except for a few rusty shelves and a large metal furnace in the corner. But what caught Jason's attention immediately was the small wooden door built into the far wall. It was strange because the door looked much older than the rest of the basement, with chipped paint and a thick metal lock that seemed unnecessary for such a small space. Jason asked the realtor what the door was for, but she simply said it probably led to an old storage crawl space and that the previous owners had kept it locked. At the time, Jason didn't feel curious enough to investigate. After moving in, he quickly settled into a routine. His days were normal: work, dinner, watching TV, then going to bed. But after the first week, something strange started happening. Every night around 2 a.m., Jason would wake up to a faint noise coming from somewhere below the floor. At first, it sounded like pipes knocking or the furnace turning on. But after a few nights, he realized the sound was different. It sounded like slow knocking. 3 dull knocks, then silence, then 3 knocks again. Jason tried to ignore it for a while, assuming it was just the house settling or old plumbing making noise. But the pattern was too consistent. Every night, the knocking came from the basement at exactly the same time. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. One night, when the knocking started again, Jason grabbed a flashlight and slowly walked toward the basement door. The sound was clearer now, definitely coming from downstairs. He hesitated for a moment before opening the door and stepping onto the creaking wooden staircase. The basement felt even colder than usual that night. The air had a damp smell, like something old and forgotten. Jason reached the bottom of the stairs and shined the flashlight across the room. Everything looked normal. The shelves were empty, the furnace was silent, and nothing seemed out of place. But then he heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it came from a small wooden door in the far wall. Jason felt a chill run through his body. Slowly, he walked across the basement floor until he was standing directly in front of the door. The knocking stopped. For several seconds, there was only silence. Jason leaned closer and placed his ear against the wood. For a moment, he heard nothing. Then suddenly something scratched against the other side of the door. Jason jumped back in shock. His heart was racing now. The scratching turned into slow, dragging sounds, like something moving across the floor just inches away from him. Jason stepped away from the door and hurried back upstairs, convincing himself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe an animal had gotten trapped in the crawl space behind the wall. The next day, he decided to finally unlock the door and check what was inside. The lock looked old and rusted, but after a few minutes, Jason managed to force it open with a screwdriver. When the door creaked open, a wave of cold air spilled out from the darkness beyond. Jason pointed his flashlight into the small opening. The beam revealed a narrow concrete tunnel extending several feet into the ground before turning sharply out of view. The tunnel looked old, far older than the house itself. Dirt covered the floor, and strange scratch marks lined the walls. Jason felt uneasy just looking at it. The space was barely tall enough for someone to crawl through. He decided not to explore any further and closed the door again. That night, the knocking returned, but this time it sounded different. Instead of coming from behind the door, the knocks echoed through the basement itself. Jason went downstairs again with his flashlight, feeling a growing sense of dread. As soon as he reached the bottom step, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The small wooden door was open. Jason was certain he had closed it earlier. Slowly, he approached the doorway and pointed the flashlight into the tunnel. At first, the light revealed only dirt and concrete. Then the beam caught something deeper in the darkness. Something pale. Jason leaned closer, tried to see more clearly. The pale shape moved. Two long arms suddenly stretched out of the darkness toward him. Jason stumbled backward and nearly dropped the flashlight. For a split second, he saw the thing inside the tunnel. A thin, human-like figure crouched deep within a narrow passage. Its skin looked gray and stretched tight across its bones. Its eyes reflected the flashlight like an animal's eyes glowing in the dark, and its mouth was open in a wide, unnatural smile. The creature slowly began crawling toward him. Its limbs moved in strange, jerking motions as it dragged itself forward through the tunnel. Jason didn't wait to see more. He ran up the stairs and slammed the basement door shut, locking it as quickly as he could. The knocking continued the entire night. But now it wasn't coming from the basement walls. It was coming directly from the other side of the basement door. Knock, knock, knock. The same 3 knocks repeated over and over. Jason didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, he had already decided to move out. He packed his belongings and left the house that afternoon, refusing to spend another night there. Months later, the house was sold to another family. Jason tried to forget about what he had seen in that basement. But one evening, while scrolling through local news online, he saw an article about the house. The headline mentioned police investigating strange noises reported by the new owners. According to the article, officers had searched the basement after the family complained about knocking sounds coming from behind a small wooden door in the wall. When the police opened the door and shined their flashlights into the tunnel, they discovered something disturbing. Fresh scratch marks lined the concrete walls, leading out of the tunnel and into the basement floor. And the tunnel itself was empty. But what truly terrified Jason was the final sentence of the article. The police report stated that investigators had found a second set of scratch marks, not on the walls, but on the inside of the basement door, as if something had been trying to get out.